Welcome to the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at The Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. I'm coming to you today from Washington, D.C., where our guests are two very special guests, I should say today, Michael Knowles of the Daily Wire and Texas Republican Senator Ted Cruz. Together, they are the dynamic duo behind Verdict with Ted Cruz, an immensely popular runaway podcast hit. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Good morning.
Talk, if you could, about how this podcast came to be. If my memory serves me correctly, this was sort of born out of the fires of impeachment, which feels like it was 20 years ago, and yet it was really only 6 months ago. But if you could talk to us just a little bit about how this podcast started, what the idea is behind it, I think that's a really interesting story, probably.
Well, you know, Emily, it had been an idea we had been talking about actually for over a year. Long before impeachment happened, we were talking about the need to move people's hearts and minds, that conservatives, libertarians, the culture is so overwhelmingly on the left that we're not doing enough to just explain basic free market principles, to explain the Constitution, to engage. And so I had been talking with Michael, talking with all the guys at Daily Wire about, all right, how can we put together a podcast? How can we dive into substance, make it fun, make it interesting? And actually it ended up was out here in L.A. last year.
Yeah, it was almost exactly 1 year ago, I think.
Meeting with you guys. We got to dinner that night, and in sort of an eerie premonition at a table about 20 feet away from us is Adam Schiff.
This is unbelievable. We were sitting there, we were having dinner at a little Mexican place in Los Angeles, and the table was almost too small. You know, it's one of these very cramped places. And the senator turns to me and goes, "Hey, you see that over there? That's Adam Schiff." And then the show takes off. It actually launches, what, now probably 8 or 9 months later, when Adam Schiff is leading the impeachment fight against the president.
So fast forward to impeachment. Impeachment happens. We've been talking about we need to do a podcast. We need to do a podcast. And as impeachment is barreling forward, it seemed like a moment where you had facts and law and the Constitution all colliding. A lot of it was confusing as all get out. And so we launched it on the first night of the impeachment trial. And when we started Verdict, we did it every night live. So at the end of the trial would end midnight, 1, 2 in the morning. I'd jump in a truck, head over to the studio, and at 2 in the morning, we would record live and just have real time, this is what happened in impeachment. And then the crazy thing is it took off.
So this was the part I hate to say I had low expectations, Senator. I did not have
low expectations.
I did not think that, you know, you're very talented, you know, a great lawyer, great senator. I did not think that Ted Cruz would beat Joe Rogan on the podcast charts. But I was proven wrong. The thing hit #1 within a week and a half. And, you know, I think part of it that was so great, it's kind of like the medium of podcasting, what makes that so great. It was a look behind the curtain. This was not a perfectly formatted show. You would get there whenever you left the Capitol.
Yeah.
You would show up. It would be 2 in the morning or later. We'd shoot however long we wanted to shoot. We'd talk about however much we wanted to talk about. And then you would go back into another full day's work the next day.
Yep.
I would try to sleep a little bit. You know, I only had one job during that time. And we would do it again. And I just think that intimacy, being able to engage with ideas on a really substantive level beyond just a 5-minute soundbite, I think that's what really allowed it to take off.
Well, and I think what people enjoyed, I mean, we basically started every one of those podcasts with, all right, what happened today? I mean, and that's how, and it would just be what went on. But part of what happened is what happened behind the scenes. So what happened in the Senate cloakroom? What was the strategy? What were the questions we were teeing up? What were the president's lawyers doing? Where were the swing votes and the votes that were in play? And I got to say, one of my favorite early podcasts we did is we started saying, so initially just the two of us. But then we said, all right, let's have some guests. And so one of the first guests we brought is I grabbed Lindsey Graham. And I said, Lindsey, come do this podcast. And first of all right, so we get to the studio. That's about midnight. And it's this, you know, you go through a dark alley in D.C., an alley, by the way, where we had our truck broken into and my briefcase stolen not long afterward.
I wasn't going to bring it up, but I think it was the third night the senator gets his briefcase stolen in D.C.
And Lindsay's like, we're going in this alley, we're going down this concrete set of stairs to a basement. And Lindsay's like, all right, does anyone know where I am? And will they send in a rescue party if I'm abandoned in this basement? And we sit down. And Lindsay's first question, he looks around and goes, what in the hell is a podcast?
Well, that's too perfect.
And I do think it was important on this point because, this was last minute. We fly in. We've got the basement studio in the middle of D.C. It wasn't exactly glitz and glamour. But I think it sent an important message, which was one of fiscal conservatism. We were not spending frivolously on that show.
Well, he also looks at the production team and goes, you guys are all kids. I'm like, yeah. Lindsay, we got to talk to people who aren't 85 years old and have dentures. Like connect. All right, but then even better. So if you've seen the set we've got, it's in D.C. The set we use. It's 2 leather chairs that look they were bought fairly inexpensively. It is a shag carpet that I'm pretty sure that we got out of the Scooby-Doo van.
We did, from the 70s, yeah.
I mean, wow. And we've got these gigantic mics in front of our face, and Lindsay looks around and goes, you guys are the #1 podcast in the world? Who in the hell is number 2?
It's number 2.
Like, is this some guy in a park, like, just yelling at a trash can?
Well, see, this speaks to something I think is really interesting, and I wanted to ask you about. Michael mentioned the medium itself and sort of the benefits of the medium itself. And I think that brings up an important question for conservatives, which is the duality of big tech. And so it did really democratize media, which needed it because it disrupted the corporate media's bad behavior. And of course, they're still behaving badly, but it at least allowed other voices to sort of tell their own story. But at the same time, that created monopolies. And so this is a question. I mean, this is a video that's going to go on YouTube and it's going to be promoted on big tech platforms like Twitter and Facebook. So in a way, we're deeply reliant on companies that behave badly to disseminate messages that disrupt the corporate media. And so this brings up a really difficult question to unpack for conservatives. I think some conservatives are concerned that people in the Republican Party are going to move towards big government republicanism again. And so I'm curious to get both of your thoughts on what you think the conservative path forward with big tech is.
Look, I think it's an enormously important question, and I agree with you, it's a difficult question. Let's start with the scope of the problem. The scope of the problem is massive. I think the threat of big tech censorship is the single greatest threat that democracy faces, that political discourse faces, that free speech faces. We've got a handful of giant monopolies with massive power, and their arrogance is growing exponentially. And they have demonstrated a repeated willingness to silence, to stifle, to muzzle speech they disagree with, to muzzle conservatives, to muzzle libertarians, to muzzle any views that are not the orthodoxy of the blob. Right. That threat, I think, is massive, and it's massive because it is ubiquitous. It's one thing. Look, media bias has been around forever. I mean, since the first journalists started carving on a stone tablet, there were biased reporters. That's just that has to do with humanity. The difference is we now have a handful of monopolies that control almost every means of discourse. 70% of Americans get their political news from social media. Yeah. How to fix it, I agree with you, is complicated. Nobody wants to see a government speech police. That would be terrible. And you do get some conservatives that reflexively say, well, they're companies and companies can do whatever they want. Well, no, that's actually not how the rule of law works. And there are limitations on what companies can and cannot do. And so I've talked about 3 possible remedies. Number 1 is something called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And it's something Congress decades ago gave big tech this special immunity from liability that nobody else has. The reason Congress gave them that immunity from liability is that Congress believed they would be neutral public forums. In other words, it wasn't fair to sue Facebook for a comment on Facebook if it's not them making the comment, if it's just some user making the comment. If they're a neutral public forum, it wasn't fair to hold them accountable. And so Congress passed Section 230 to give them this special protection. Big tech is no longer neutral. They're not pretending to be neutral. They're actively biased. They're suppressing views they disagree with. They're promoting views they agree with. If they're not going to be neutral, there's no reason on earth, I think, that they should get a special immunity from liability that nobody else enjoys. So that's one lever. It's a special privilege they've been given that their conduct, I think, means they no longer deserve. Number two is the antitrust laws. We've long had antitrust laws that you cannot abuse monopoly power. Google and YouTube have a monopoly position, and they are abusing that monopoly position. In fact, they did it with the Federalist. When they cut off your advertising at the Federalist, they were abusing the monopoly power. They were doing it there for commercial gain. They were imposing conditions on the Federalist that they don't impose on YouTube, which makes them billions of dollars. And so the antitrust laws are a second avenue. And the third avenue, it sounds in either breach of contract or consumer fraud. And put simply, the basic promise that social media makes to users is if you sign up and you post, the people who choose to follow you will hear what you post. And if you choose to follow someone, you'll hear what they post. That's the basic implicit promise of social media. We now know that promise is a lie, that they are shadow banning, and they are shadow banning rampantly, where consumers think if I follow Michael Knowles and he says some dumbass comment, which I know would never happen. Never happen. It's purely hypothetical. But if I followed him, it means I want to see what he has to say. And big tech is breaking that promise.
This is that issue of fraud. You know, we sat down with the Attorney General a couple weeks ago in D.C., and there's this broader fraud that has been perpetrated by big tech, which is that you think that you're able to go in and to this neutral public space. That's how they got this critical mass. That's how they got these monopolies. And then guess what? They changed the rules at the very end for every reason that the senator just mentioned. We can go after them. I think on this point of some conservatives who are a little nervous and they don't want to exercise power, what you said on the show a few weeks ago was the key here. How do we stop the abuses at big tech? Yes. All of the above, use every tool that we can, legally, politically, use those tools, because this is the threat. You know, we boast a little bit about the show jumping up to #1 in its first weeks. As much as I want to take credit for that as the hosts of the show, I think a big part of that is that when the gatekeepers lose their power, conservative messages get through. There are audiences hungry for this stuff, and there are gatekeepers who are trying to prevent it. So conservatives do very well on social media, and then when we do too well, a lot of left-wingers get very upset by this, and they try to shut us down, and we should not take that lying down.
Yeah, the gatekeepers are corrupt, and that's true with traditional media, and that's true with now social media, is truth scares them. They don't want people to actually be able to communicate what they believe, because their ideas are garbage. Their ideas don't work. And so when you're pushing a failed socialist ideology, then the only way it can succeed is if you silence dissent. It's actually, there's a lot of similarity between big tech and China.
Yeah.
Totalitarianism, you silence dissent because dissent is a fundamental threat to your power. And to leftists, they don't want free speech. All right, I'll give you an example. I had a conversation with the CEO of YouTube who came to my office. She was sitting in my office. And we were talking about Steven Crowder. So Steven Crowder is Steven's a friend of mine. He does a great job. Although I did a show with you guys where we were putting our ashes in a Steven Crowder mug, which I thought was really damn funny.
He makes a great ashtray. There's no question about it.
I will confess, I promised that I would smoke cigars with him and put ashes in your mugs too. I said it was an equal opportunity. But YouTube did what they did to you, so they started with Steven Crowder demonetizing him. Now, here's the amazing thing of what the YouTube CEO told me. She said, well, look, you should be happy. We didn't ban him from YouTube. We just cut off all his money.
Yeah, yep. The bar is low.
Yeah.
And I pointed out, and she said, well, look, we were being pushed from the left to ban him entirely, to make it just impossible for him to broadcast his show. And I made a point to her. I said, listen, the calls for censorship are only coming from one side.
Yeah.
It's only the left. I'm not asking you to silence some crazy socialist. Please put Bernie Sanders and AOC on as often as possible. Because their ideas are nonsense. So it's one side that wants to use government power to silence, and the other side that believes in free speech. Yeah.
But they don't just want to use government power. They also want to use corporate power. And this is particularly interesting. I was going to ask you both about the what is now known as the Harper's Letter last week, which is a coalition of about 150 media and academic elites who had to come together and talk about how they affirm their commitment to, quote, open debate. So it's sort of a remarkable statement in and of itself about how far we've gone. But these people are, they're pushing back on people that learned this stuff in the classroom and took it to the boardroom and took it to the newsroom. And these are people in power. There was a lot of pushback to that letter. There are people in major newsrooms who signed a rebuttal to it, essentially saying, we support open debate, but open debate, by the way, means that you can't question our lives as transgender individuals. And that's a hugely important conversation to have honestly and openly, because children's lives are at stake. And it's a serious thing to have to talk about. So I'm curious if you think the success of your podcast speaks to the failure of the media. And I'm also curious for your thoughts on what is our way out of this when the left has its roots now planted so deeply in the institutions of power, whether it's corporate America or Hollywood or newsrooms.
So, look, the Harper's Letter, I actually tweeted it out and did something I've never done before, which is I said it in my entire life, I've never agreed with Noam Chomsky.
Yeah, Noam Chomsky, Gloria Steinem, Senator.
Chilly day in hell.
J.K. Rowling, J.K. Rowling is suddenly on the outs as an untouchable, condemned person because she made the following statement: there exists such a thing as a woman. And to say that,
that's you're gonna get
shame. No. I mean, it really is. Look, 3 years ago, if we'd have been talking now, it might have been we would have been talking in one of those talkies that you had to rev up. But if we'd have suggested this, a year ago, this would have sounded loony.
Yeah, that's right.
And it still does. But people are afraid. People are afraid because they use power to silence any dissenting views. And Ed, look, part of that is the product of bad ideas. Mm-hmm. John Stuart Mill, as you know, and On Liberty, said the best cure for bad speech is more speech. Right. I am more than happy to have leftists spew their nonsense if you can have a rebuttal, because truth prevails. But I think the reason people like the podcast format in particular, but I think also like our Verdict podcast, is that we try to get into some substance. Look, I mean, I do lots of different media interviews that, you have a 6-minute interview where you get out a soundbite or two and you get a little snippet and that's it. And the nice thing about a podcast is we don't spend 4 hours, but we spend a half hour talking about a substance, an issue and substance. And, I do think maybe the most frequent comment on our podcast that people make is I learned something.
Yeah, that's right.
There was kind of something new that I didn't know that I now feel I understand this issue better, and that's what we're hoping to be doing.
Yeah, the substance, I think, is the key, because a lot of what we're getting at here is the conservative worldview. Is it just about form and procedure, or is it substantive as well? Is there substance? And I think obviously there is. There are things. It's not merely that we want there to be free speech, but we want to say certain things as well. And this was the issue, I think, in the letter from Harper's, notorious letter, is they have this basically unobjectionable statement that they support free speech. And then the letter comes out, and the moment it comes out, already some people who signed it want to remove their names because they don't want to be associated with the other people who have signed on to it. So you worry if these statements are a little bit of weak sauce right now. When we talk about the institutions, which you mentioned, Emily, it occurs to me the left talks about institutional oppression all the time. Institutional racism and thisism and thatism. The left controls, to my mind, all of the institutions, mainstream media, Hollywood, big tech, higher education, lower education, administrative government, the list goes on and on. So if there is institutional oppression, whose fault would that be? I think, we need to say things clearly. We need to go a little bit deeper than just 30-second or 2-minute sound bites, and that's kind of what we're trying to do.
Well, there's a broader reason for that, which is the left understands the power of ideas. And starting in the 1960s, systematically the left, they seized the organs of transmission of ideas. So they took education, K through 12. They took universities, which are hopelessly disasters right now. They seized almost all of journalism. And most significantly, they seized entertainment, Hollywood, sports, music, video games. I mean, the left seized it all. And you think about it, so the best and the brightest on the left, they go into one of those worlds or into politics. So Barack Obama is the epitome of the perfect leftist. Yep. On the right, what do the best and brightest do? They go make money.
They make money. Right.
They go into business. They go make money. And so we have, for now 60 years, systematically had an asymmetric playing field where one side is brainwashing. We are inculcating the youth. We are pitching our message. And the other side didn't even show up. Yeah. The other side isn't even there. Now, thankfully, there are some pushbacks. Look, what y'all are doing at the Federalist, what the Daily Wire are doing, I mean, there is a young generation of people rising up and engaging and speaking out against the Borg. But it ain't easy. And it takes being able to break through the gatekeepers.
Right, which is increasingly difficult because, as you mentioned, historically, Republicans have gone out, or conservatives have gone out into the world and made money, but it seems as though this kind of progressive or bigot binary that the left insisted on in academia and then migrated into the real world has created a system where even big business has been taken over by the cultural left. So they may still, they're not going to dismantle the capitalist system, but they are going to dismantle traditional values because they think it helps them sell their products, whatever it is, which is in itself kind of hilarious because it shows that the left is perpetuating the capitalist system.
Well, this is the point on the substance, right? Because if we merely say, okay, everything government does is terrible and everything business does is good, which is only a slight caricature, I think, of what some Republicans have said over the years. Well, then when big business becomes the main promoter of the leftist cultural agenda, we don't have much of an argument.
There's also the big lie in politics is that Republicans are the party of the rich and Democrats are the party of the poor.
Yep.
That just ain't true. Today's
Certainly
Democratic Party is the party of Silicon Valley billionaires. Today's Democratic Party is the party of Michael Bloomberg. It is the party of power. It is the party of suppression. It is jackbooted thugs who will enforce their will through force. That's who the Democratic Party represents. Today's Republican Party are Ohio steelworkers. Right. Today's Republican Party are single moms waiting tables who are filled with opportunities. They're people like my dad when he was a teenage immigrant from Cuba washing dishes. And it's entirely inverted. So all the time I encounter Bernie Sanders supporters, like typically, kids, like high school kids, college kids. And I'll tell them, listen, I agree with Bernie. Bernie says Washington's corrupt. He says both parties are in on it. That's all true. Here's the difference. If you think Washington's corrupt, why would you want to give Washington more power?
Yep.
And right. That fundamental corruption, leftists believe in power. They want to control you. Look, in the midst of this pandemic, we've seen idiocies. One of the images that will always stick with me is here in California, local officials using a bulldozer to put sand in a skate park. And again, I took on Twitter and said, listen, this is what the left wants to do. They want to use power to stop you. And by the way, I'm perfectly fine if they want to send a police officer over and say social distance, like kids don't get too close. We're dealing with a virus. It's dangerous. So keep a little distance between you. But no, they just filled the skate park with sand. And it's just, they are,
Who would have thought that conservatives would be praising punk skateboarders? I mean, this is what we're talking about, an inversion of the groups that you would associate with the two parties.
Well, but look, freedom has a rebellious quality. It's one of the things, to use a Star Wars analogy, and conservatives are terrible at this, we step into the role of, we are the big business automatons. What crap!
Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right, that is awesome. And for everyone watching, that was not staged.
Yeah,
he's really just here on the couch.
I suppose the silver lining of the storm cloud of this past several months of the virus is Baby Yoda. So it's good to get Baby Yoda out there.
That's true.
But look, the right, we are the Rebel Alliance. You want to understand the left? They are Vader. They are the Emperor. They are the Empire. They are about control and stormtroopers. And look, fighting against the power of Silicon Valley and the media and the collective restraint, freedom is heretical, but it's also fun.
Yeah.
Like, I don't care if someone disagrees, God bless you. You got a right to disagree, and let's have a healthy conversation. It's only one side that is not frightened by that freedom.
Sure.
Great. So I have two final questions, and the first one is it's music to my ears. I've heard the term fiscal conservatism several times over the course of this conversation, which is wonderful. But I also, the Senator, you had an interesting tweet the other day about what might happen with DACA, and the president did an interview saying, he's going to consider a path forward for a pathway to citizenship, and I wonder if either of you has concerns about sort of the shifting winds in the conservative movement. I think a lot of things are up in the air right now, and the conservative movement is sort of figuring out its identity and regrouping. But I do wonder if you do have any fears going forward about perhaps a big government mentality taking over the conservative movement.
Yeah, look, I'm very concerned by that. I mean, we've got our national debt is dramatically skyrocketing, and coronavirus has made that much, much worse. On any spending bill in Congress, you have a massive bipartisan supermajority for spending. If you have $1 trillion bill, you get all the Democrats, you get half the Republicans. In the Senate, there are about 20 of us who will vote no on spending bills. And we are a distinct minority, not just in the Senate, but in the Republican conference. We're a little bit fewer than half of the Republicans. And so it's sort of a lonely, and a lot of times, to be honest, Republican leadership doesn't even bother to talk to conservatives. They're like, yeah, we don't care we're cutting a deal with Chuck Schumer. Right. And the way we buy Schumer's vote is we spend more money. And that is highly, highly worrisome on immigration. Look, securing the border. And that was one of the big things that elected Donald Trump, was building the wall, securing the border. It's the right thing to do. And the truth of the matter is that same coalition that will spend us into bankruptcy is also just fine with open borders. You get the same coalition of all the Democrats and half the Republicans. And it's the big business view, which is, hey, unlimited illegal immigration is cheap labor. Isn't that fabulous? I believe we are and should be a blue-collar party, that we are the party of working men and women, and unlimited illegal immigration drives down wages. And so one of the things I've called on the president is to halt temporary work visas right now, because when you got 44 million people unemployed, and I'm a supporter of legal immigration when it is benefiting the labor market, but when over 20% of working Americans are out of a job, I think we need to get the economy moving and get Americans working again first. On DACA also, I think rule of law matters. What Barack Obama did was lawless. It was contrary to federal law. It was contrary to the Constitution. And initially what the president said in an interview with, I don't remember, it was either Univision or Telemundo, I forget which one, but he said they were thinking about just issuing an executive order granting a path to citizenship for people here illegally. And I sent out a tweet and said, look, the president has no authority to do that. That is contrary to law, and it's unconstitutional. It was unconstitutional when Obama did it, and if Trump did it, it'd be unconstitutional there. Thankfully, within a few hours, the White House walked that back. So I'm hoping that was a slip of the tongue rather than a real policy initiative, and I was encouraged that they stepped back from that position.
That's right, and I think an important point here too is that fiscal issues are cultural issues. I mean, that's
Yes.
I think what we're getting at here. And the great conservative philosopher Edmund Burke, he warned us against being sophisters, economists, and calculators. We don't want to be a party of eggheads. We want to talk about the cultural issues, but what does it say about a society that the inheritance that it leaves to its children is debt? $20 trillion of debt. Patrick Deneen makes this point in Why Liberalism Failed. A society that has no regard for its future, that just saddles its future with debt, is probably not going to have much regard for its past either, which is how you see statues being toppled all around the country. And I think when we can ground these fiscal debates in the real cultural issues that resonate in all of us, that's going to be a path forward that is inspiring for conservatives moving forward.
Well, and Emily and I talked about how on the Verdict podcast people learned something. So I learned something today, and then doing this with Michael, that this right now is the first time in my life I've ever heard the word sophister. I've heard sophistry, but I'm assuming a sophister is one who practices sophistry.
Yeah, he's a pro at sophistry.
But I'm just saying that. All right, Emily, think about it for a second. Have you ever heard anyone use the word sophisters?
I've heard sophist. I've not heard sophisters.
Okay, all right.
I should not have quoted Burke. I should have only taken that for myself.
Yeah.
We'll edit that out later. I want all the credit.
I want to.
By the way, I got to tell a quick story. I'm newly elected to the Senate, 2013, and we're in the middle of debate in the Senate Judiciary Committee over guns, over the Second Amendment, and they're arguing about the so-called assault weapons ban, which was in effect, and then it expired. And actually, the Clinton Justice Department studied it and found it had zero statistically significant impact on reducing violent crime. And I was making the point, so Al Franken, who was on Judiciary, was arguing that we needed to do this to stop violent crime. And I pointed out, well, actually, the Clinton Justice Department studied it. It didn't have that effect. And I said, anyone arguing to the contrary is engaged in sophistry. Fast forward 2-3 hours. We're on the Senate floor. I'm standing down there voting. Franken runs up to me and goes, Ted, you said I engaged in sophistry today. I didn't know what that was, but I went and looked it up, and now I'm really mad.
He's like, I think you might have proved my point there, Al, but who knows?
I was, it's not often that I'm speechless with my colleagues, but I just kind of was like, okay.
It's not a word that you often hear on Saturday Night Live.
That's true. That's true.
So I want to ask about China.
I should have said, Al, you're okay, and gosh darn it, people like you.
Well, hindsight is 2020.
Yeah.
So I want to ask about China, and this is kind of a two-part question. I want to ask about TikTok, and I want to ask about Hollywood. The Senator, you've introduced a very important bill, I think, and it's not a bill that's going to change the world, but it is a bill that addresses something important, which is that our military has collaborated with some Hollywood studios on films that they have allowed to the CCP essentially to censor. One of the most obvious examples being the new Top Gun movie that's set to come out, where the Taiwanese flag was removed from that iconic bomber jacket. I want to ask, first of all, if you heard anything from Hollywood or the Pentagon after that bill was introduced. And I also want to get both of your thoughts on whether TikTok should be banned, whether you think the threat from the administration to ban TikTok is a serious one.
Senator, before you answer, I have to caution you that if you criticize China and the Communist Party anymore, they may increase the length of your ban from Beijing. So
That's
just
right.
watch
The
out.
senator's been banned. As of today, the senator's banned.
So last night, while I was sleeping, China sanctioned me, and so I picked up the phone this morning, and my phone is my alarm clock, and I had a whole series of texts that China has announced they have now sanctioned me, which led me to tweet, I mean, what a bummer, the family and I had been planning to vacation in Beijing right after Tehran. It was our next stop. Look, Chinese communists are murdering, torturing, lying, evil bastards. Maybe you can understand why they sanctioned me.
Hold on. It's starting to make sense now. Okay.
Look, I don't like people that engage in mass murder and torture and oppression, and by the way, are responsible for a global pandemic that has a massive death count worldwide. China engages in rampant censoring. So the beginning of coronavirus pandemic, they censored, they suppressed the Chinese whistleblowers, the heroic doctors who pointed out the coronavirus was spreading in Wuhan, China. Chinese government went and arrested them and said, you must recant, you can't tell anyone about this virus. That's their pattern. Now, we were talking before, and this connects, Emily, very well with our conversation before. Big business is so often willing to be complicit with totalitarianism, and especially when it comes to China, the almighty dollar, like access to the Chinese government, things like the NBA, the groveling of the NBA. I thought it was a bit much when they actually drew Mao's head on every basketball, but that's where they are. And it's so Hollywood. And by the way, these are these virtue signaling righteous leftists are perfectly happy for the Chinese communists to tell them to censor. So you're right. Top Gun's the sequel. Maverick's jacket, they didn't just take out the Taiwanese flag, they also took out the Japanese flag. Both of them are on the back of Maverick's jacket in the original movie. I'll give you another example. Bohemian Rhapsody, fabulous movie.
Yes. This is a great example because it appeals to the left.
Yeah.
Well, and the Chinese government insisted that they edit out scenes showing that Freddie Mercury was gay.
Yep.
Now, how do you tell Freddie Mercury's story without, like, acknowledging that he was gay? It was a big part of who he was, and what an incredible musician. And China, these woke social justice warriors said, sure, erase out the part showing he's gay. Like, come on, guys, have a tiny modicum of backbone. And this is an interesting, it's a similar challenge to the social media challenge. So we've got corporate actors behaving really badly. What do you do about it? So it would be the wrong thing, just like with social media. I would not want to see the federal government coming in and stopping them from censoring. But there are all sorts of incentives. And so what I introduced is a bill called the Script Act that says that if you want access to federal government assets, so lots of movie makers use, particularly in the Pentagon, they use ships, they use planes, they use tanks, they use all sorts of equipment, and the Pentagon lets them use it to make movies. And so my bill says, look, if you want access to federal government assets, you can't be complicit in Chinese communist censorship. Now, by the way, if you don't want access to them, censor all you want. You have a right to do it, but we ain't going to provide you the material if you're going to engage in the censorship. You asked what the Pentagon thought. So the Pentagon, actually, we talked with the Pentagon and worked with them. They pressed for, and we've introduced a couple of versions of the bill, they pressed for making it government-wide. They said, don't just make it Pentagon assets.
That's great.
Make it government-wide assets. So, for example, DHS, there'll be times when, like, border security equipment or something, movies need it. So we've introduced a version that's broader, but it's trying to use leverage and incentives to encourage behavior that's not harmful.
The sad thing is that to an extent, and we've reported this out at the Federalist, they're already self-censoring before these scripts were even written. They're terrified to write anything that would upset the CCP because they'll get blacklisted. It's not even a matter of sending the script to the CCP in many cases. But for final thoughts, ban TikTok? Do you think we should ban TikTok in the United States? And do you think that this administration is serious about implementing such a measure?
TikTok worries me a lot. TikTok, the Chinese government has real control over TikTok. I'm worried about it as a surveillance tool. I'm worried about it as an espionage tool. I'm worried about it as an identity theft tool, as a tool to steal the information on your phone. I don't have TikTok on my phone. Now, look, I've got two girls who, I got to tell you, among junior high kids, TikTok is like next to the heart. And I can tell you, Caroline this week said, Dad, do you have Donald Trump's number on your phone? I want to call him and tell him don't ban TikTok. So I did not give my daughter the president's phone number.
That was probably a wise decision, but I don't know. Friends in high places, I guess, that's a good way to use it. I guess this would also tie in with the social conservative aspect because it's this national security threat, and also just socially. TikTok is it like fries your brain. It is so much input, so much stimulus. Maybe that's the next step for verdict.
You're saying you can process things in larger than 10-second increments? I don't understand. All right, so can we close this, Emily? The two of us are going to dance in synchrony. Synchrony? Well, synchrony is not a word.
I think it's like sophistry.
There you go.
Well, you guys will have to write a new verdict dictionary. I think that's what's the next step to. Well, we're very grateful to both of you for your time this morning. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks.
Thank you, Emily.
Well, I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor at The Federalist. You've been listening to Michael Knowles and Texas Republican Senator Ted Cruz. They are the hosts of Verdict with Ted Cruz, which is available on all of the podcasting platforms. It's available on YouTube. Thank you so much for listening today. Until next time, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.